Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight is our ongoing series of Occult and Crochet. And with that, we go over whatever crochet project I'm working on at the moment, and then we dive into a person from either the spiritual history, religious history, or occult history. And this is the shawl I've been working on for like 2 weeks now, and normally I'm a little bit faster, but I've got a lot going on in real life right now. But it is this nice butterfly shawl, although it looks a little bit more like dragonflies when you get out farther. But that's the color pattern. It'll end up going through some primary rainbow-ish colors out to a light purple. It's gonna look kind of like a chakra line when I'm done with it, because that's kind of was my goal when I got this yarn. So that's where that is. I've only, like I said, added a couple of rows to it since I got started, which is not the best thing, but it's been a minute. So if I'm a little shiny, it's very toasty right now. So that's welcome to middle of Idaho, August. Anyway, our subject for this evening, our occult subject, since we've been kind of going over a lot of the witchcraft, Wicca, modern day things, and kind of how it got buried because it was being a reawakening of an ancient religion. And there are people who will say that, oh, it didn't happen that way. There's always been a vein of mysticism or spiritual paths, and a lot of it did get passed through families. Maybe not in the way that Gerald Gardner and some of the other ones claimed, but there's always been a thread to that. But why was it buried? And that's what I've been kind of introducing with this topic the last week and then this week. And tonight we're going to talk about another of our infamous witch hunters, and that is Balthasar von Dernbach, or it could be Balthasar, but either way. It's an interesting name, but the man behind this name, let's just say he's not the greatest person. Balthasar was born in 1548, so we're hopping way back in the time machine. And interestingly enough, this is after the publication of one of the primary witch hunting books, which is the Malleus Maleficarum. So, and it wasn't referenced in this particular line of study, but it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't use aspects of this, because this was the primary witch hunting training manual, basically, for this time period. So, but Balthasar was born in 1548. His family was connected to the von Dernbach family, which obviously is his surname, but it's a family that is connected to traditional nobility and knighthood. So we're not talking about just some random dude who rose through the ranks. He was born into a pretty high standing overall. It is said that his family line can be traced to the 13th century as liegeman of the Landgrave of Hesse. This is the area around where we would say is Germany today. At least that's how I found it. The old maps and the new maps don't always line up so well, but it's that vicinity of Germany. Balthasar was of a noble line, so in some ways that's kind of a cool thing, but not in the situation. Balthasar was born in the area of Wiesenfeld in Hesse. His father was Peter von Dernbach, and his mother was Clara Klauer von und zu Wara. It's quite a name for his mother, quite the mouthful. Moving on. He was the youngest son, and that's how it's referenced in multiple spots. There's other places said that he was the youngest child, but the majority of them said he was the youngest son specifically of, get this, 15 children. 1 through 15 at minimum. And the only thing I could say when I read that was, dude, get off her. Just, that's a lot of kids. And the references, like I said, were very specific to the youngest son. So it could have had younger sisters, but no other males were born into this family line. And those older times were a little bit crazy with the birth rates. Part of which was the survival rate was kind of low at the time, way lower than it is today. But you also, that's kind of what you did, was you didn't have a lot of prophylactics back in the day. So Balthasar was baptized within the Lutheran Church as a baby, and what I found weird, and I couldn't quite place where this lined up, and I dug around a little bit, but I couldn't find exact information, so we'll just give you both sides of it. The father, Peter, was said to be either a very strict Lutheran or the last Catholic in Hesse. I'm not sure why there was such a disconnect in how his father's spiritual practice was, but that does come into play. That's why I'm referencing it. Balthasar's father was a liegeman of Philip I. Now, liegeman is a kind of knight in high standing within a culture. And Philip I was the Landgrave of Hesse, so kind of like the lord of the area, kind of like a duke, elder, whatever you want to call it, but he was in that situation, so he was pretty high up. It's important to note this, since Philip I was a big supporter, interestingly, of the Protestant Reformation, the Lutherans and all others that came after that, which makes me think that the strict Lutheran part is kind of accurate for his for Balthasar's dad, although it is said that Peter was very critical of Philip's religious practices. So it could have been like, we want strict doctrine. Philip's like, we'll let that slide. So there was some little bit of conflict before Balthasar was even grown up. Peter, his father, would pass away when Balthasar was approximately 12 years old. I couldn't find details on why Dad died. There's probably some out there. I don't read German, so there's that. His mother, Clara, decided to send Balthasar away to Fulda, to a monastery there. And at 12, being shipped off to a monastery sounds a little extreme, except how is she going to take care of all these kids? Like, yeah, the oldest ones were probably out of the house at this point, but she still would have had probably 6 or 7, if not 8 of these little monsters running around the house. So, pawn off what you can. And really, a monastery is not the worst place to be. Not if you look at it today's standard, that would be a nightmare. But back in the day, they were theoretically a little bit nicer. On the upside, and this is one of the reasons that he was sent there, Balthasar's uncle, Clara's brother, was the Prince Abbot of the Fulda Monastery. Didn't know what this was. A Prince Abbot is a very powerful position in that day. He held a seat and vote in the imperial court. He also held a seat and a vote, taking it all the way up to the papacy. So he had direct line to the Pope at that time. He would be ranked above all other abbots and abbesses, female abbots of the nunneries, and they answered only to the Lord of the land and the Pope himself. These were exceptionally powerful political and religious people. And there's a quote from a movie, when politics and religion ride in the same cart, the whirlwind follows. Something to think about. Frank Herbert knew what he was talking about when he wrote Dune. Mixing politics and religion, there's a reason that we always say, in my circle anyway, when you mix those two, people get burned at the stake. And this is why. Where was I? Clara's brother, the Prince Abbot, had an equally impressive name. Of course he did. Wilhelm Hartmann Klauer Kon und Wora. What a mouthful, and I apologize for any pronunciation errors. I tried to listen to these names and get them down as close as I could. Not the easiest thing in the world to do, especially when you don't speak the language. The monastery was of Catholic lineage, so Balthasar's young Lutheran upbringing went right out the window, tossed it out. And at the age of 18, which I find this weird, but this happened a lot in this time frame, he was ordained into the priesthood in 1566. At this time, he would have been ordained into the Benedictine monk path. So, 18 years old, and all of a sudden now you're a fully ordained Benedictine monk. You were a ordained priest, you were able to officiate, well, everything. That's kind of impressive and a lot of responsibility. I mean, not to be rude, but look around today. How many 18-year-olds are even anywhere near ready for that? And how many 18-year-olds would want to do this? Like, this is a huge responsibility. Later, in 1570, Balthasar would be elected the Prince Abbot of the Fulda Monastery following his uncle. And it looks like his uncle had passed away and he was nominated to be the next Prince Abbot, judging by his, lineage. That doesn't surprise me that much. And this I thought was interesting because it was noted in several places that he had been personally confirmed to the Prince Abbot position by Pope Pius V. And I poked around a little bit. Popes didn't always confirm. They might do it from a distance, but he was personally confirmed. So I don't know if that was like he got a letter of recommendation, if the Pope actually traveled to Hesse to personally do it. That part was unclear, but it was referenced that he was personally confirmed. So and that one I will say is kind of cool, but what Balthasar does later is not so. We won't give him that much credit. The position of Prince Abbot would actually be very beneficial for Balthasar and his brothers. Little nepotism here. He would go on to use his position to get his brothers Otto, Melchior, and Wilhelm higher offices within the area. Most of these were some form of either church or governmental positions. Otto became a martial provost, which was kind of like a religious law enforcer. Melchior would become a martial bailiff, which was more governmental. But Wilhelm would become the commander of the Teutonic Knights at Oddingham and Kopfenberg. German names, I love how they sound. I never can say them right. And I can literally listen to them and repeat myself over and over, and they just don't come out that right. So, thanks to his Catholic training, Balthasar would decide he was turning against Philip I after fashion. He would take up a policy of counter-reformationism. This was in the 1571, and to basically push back against the Lutheran training that Philip was pushing, the more, and I use this term very loosely because at this time Lutherans were so strict by today's standards, but it was a bit more liberal and ideological than the Catholics at the time, and so Philip was a bit more open to other ideas and other beliefs, which I can respect him for. But in 1571, Balthasar was pretty much like, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. So he called in the Jesuit order to found a school and a college. Lower learning, grammar school, middle school, moderate high school type stuff, but also into higher learning. So college, university, high-minded stuff. But under the careful, you can read between the lines here, brainwashing and threatening, care of the Jesuit order. These were not people to be messed with, especially in this time period. The Jesuits have a really interesting history, and I might go over that at some point. There's certain ones of these orders that they have some interesting things that occur even today, so it's best to tread lightly. Doesn't mean I won't, just I have to think about that. Balthasar would push for those in the order to take up full monastic lifestyles. He would go so far as to order all subjects in the territory that he had dominion over, which is the Fulda and surrounding territory, to return to their Catholic belief systems or get out. I don't want you here. If you're not willing to bend the knee to the Pope's ring, bounce, you're done. No more Protestants and Lutherans within the territory that Balthasar would be in charge of. Such a loving and compassionate person our little Balthasar was. But this is getting into the important part of why I'm even talking about this goofball. And by goofball, I mean this goofball. In some ways, he would be seen as a hero to some people. I would never term him that because of what happens. I'll take his mug down because I don't want to see it. Um, Not everyone was okay with Balthasar's newfound faith. The magistrates, a lot of the judges and lawyers, the knights, and even the lord of that land, so one of his superiors, were against these moves of trying to chase out the Lutherans and the Protestants. They sent multiple threats, not one or two, multiple threats of increasing violence over time to Balthasar, telling him to stand down and drop this. And eventually, he seemed hell-bent on ignoring their threats. All of the knights, his peers basically, in bloodline at least, would turn on him, and they allied with a neighboring sect led by Julius Ector von Mespelbren, of Wurzburg. He was the prince bishop of a neighboring land, so this is a neighboring religious order. This alignment would eventually drive Balthasar to his knees. For now. He doesn't stay there. Balthasar would sign under duress a letter of abdication in 1576, handing over his territory to Julius and the knights. There was a clause added to this abdication that the new leader Julius would tolerate all Protestants within the land, and starting with the knights, as they could practice their religious beliefs as they chose. And from what I could find, it wasn't just Lutheranism, it was also some of the older beliefs as well. They weren't referenced primarily, but it wouldn't surprise me that area if there wasn't some Druid aligned stuff going on there too. So this was a unique time period. But because this agreement occurred, Balthasar eventually would flee after signing this agreement because he wasn't very popular, going after people's religions, shutting them down, telling him to get out if you're not going to follow what I say. Kind of culty in that respect, huh? He ended up going to the Archbishop of Mainz. This particular archbishop would go on to give Balthasar, and this is a weird thing, here, stay in this castle at Bieberstein and live there for the time being till we sort this all out. Balthasar was not one to be idle, and felt very slighted and offended by the way things had went. So he publicly revoked his abdication, and then filed a complaint with Emperor Maximilian II, and also filed a complaint with the current Pope. And in this time period, popes lasted for 5 to 7 years. Few of them lasted a little bit longer, but not many. So the current Pope, Gregory XIII, was who he filed with. And this would also be filed with a petition to be reinstated to his position as Prince Abbot at Fulda. And Pope Gregory, being an interesting cat, we'll go over him later, because the popes from about the 14th century up through about mid-17th century, boy, do they have some skeletons in their closet. Some of them are pretty fascinating, some of them are super boring. We'll go over the fun ones. But Gregory was one of the ones that we're going to dig a little into because he's got some got some interesting things about him. He decided to threaten to excommunicate Julius if he didn't give Balthasar back his position in Fulda. And Julius, he was a smart dude. He decided that no, this is a political and religious position. You can make your claim in court. I'm suing you. So for 25 years, Julius drug this thing out. This matter would be tied up in the courts. So this entire time, Balthasar's cooling his heels at this other place at Castle Bieberstein, away from Fulda, away from his family, anybody he really knew. He was completely away from him. 25 years. I'm sorry. That was a genius move, Julius. But Balthasar was not fully idle at this time. He decided to turn his attention to a seminary at Fulda that Pope Gregory himself had established for the students of the nobility specifically. Of course, nobles, we can't have the commoners mixing with the royal blood. And the one thing that I will say that Balthasar did during this time period that I actually will give him credit for, not a big fan, but I'll give him credit for, was he opened up about 60 places within the seminary for the quote-unquote lesser families of the burghers, the burgs, the suburbs of the area, basically the commoner and the working class. So he allowed some of these other people to get in. I think he was personally doing it to expand his specific form of Catholicism, but we'll get into that. After this power play by Julius, which, like I said, was a genius, it eventually turned out to be a losing play by Julius. The courts ruled in 1602 that the knights and city leaders were to pay a fine and all expenses of the proceedings. This council would also reinstate Balthasar. And you can hear rumblings in the background here. As soon as Balthasar was back in power, he went back to his Counter-Reformation work with a vengeance. This time, he would fully reclaim the land for the Catholic Church by any means necessary. He was convinced, in his weirdly addled mind, that the devil walked among the land and was infecting people with witchcraft. Evil of any forms, any subversion to the church itself was deemed witchcraft. Seriously. The same year he was reinstated, 1602, he would openly declare, sign papers of writ, whatever you want to call it, that the witch trials were being instated to root out the evil that went against the church and all people who chose not to follow the Catholic's view of life. Okay. So, Balthasar wouldn't just do this all himself. He would kind of move the chess pieces, so to speak. But he would appoint another person, a second Balthasar, to oversee the witch trials. Balthasar Nuss, and we're going to call him B2 to keep them separate. He would be in charge of the trials. B2 had become acquainted and eventually attached himself, basically by hook or by crook, to Balthasar when he was in exile. B2 would be appointed to the title of Zentgraf. New word. It basically means criminal judge or criminal justice prosecutor. So he was the one who was trying a lot of these trials. B2 would be a divine hammer to smash the evil of the witches. Or basically, if you didn't believe the Catholics, we're going to call you a witch and put you on trial and do things to you. Under the persecution, and yes, I'm calling it that, of these two Balthasars, they would prosecute and execute between 200 and 250 people, depending on source material and records and things like that. It's interesting that the name Balthasar shows up, because in modern days, like if you watch Charmed, apparently he shows up in Supernatural, and also in Constantine, there's demons that are named Balthasar. Funny, it's almost like they might have read some history books. And one person that I do want to bring up, because this is actually how I first heard of Balthasar in this aspect. Let me put a note here real quick because I just totally spaced it. And there. Okay. Sorry. Doing these things live and on the fly. I was watching during, when the world stopped further for about a year in 2020. I was watching a lot of biographies, history stuff. My fascination for these things is nonstop. And I ran across the name Murga Bien, or Bien, depending on how it's said. I heard both different videos. She is the most famous of the witches that these two would go after, and that's when I first heard of Balthasar and Balthasar. She was born in the city of Fulda. There's not a lot known, but I want to emphasize her because what happened to her was disturbing at best, and the accusations from what I can dig up and what was brought up in these videos that I've watched, she was kind of given the worst of things. They all were treated very poorly, but she kind of got this stinky end of the stick here. She was born and raised in the city of Fulda. She would be married twice, and both men would die. She would be the inheritor of their entire estates. And no cause of death was ever mentioned, and I've dug into it over the years. I could not find a cause of death. It could be something in German I haven't been able to figure out. And the other side, though, is death found people really easily back in the day, and if he happened to be a soldier in the knighthood, or if he was, I don't know, got ran over by an animal out in the field, it doesn't take much in this time period to die. So her being married twice before this started is not that surprising. Murga would eventually marry a third husband by the name of Blasius Bien, and this is where things start to get a little squirrely. They'd be married for about 14 years. They would at one point move away from Fulda following his job, and after a disagreement with the hubby's Blasius's employers, and it's specified as multiple employers, they would eventually kind of return to Fulda almost in disgrace. And we're not really sure what happened. No one's specific on it, but that part's not that important. It does show up here in a second, but it's not like the focus. When they returned, Murga is the one that got in trouble, not the hubby number 3. On June 19th of 1603, about a year after he officially signed the documents to start the witch trials, the investigations would lead to Murga being arrested. The first wave of arrests would actually begin after the investigations in March of 1903. So this was only 3 months later Murga got wrapped up in this. Hubby number 3 would protest loudly before the legislature, petitioning even the Lord of the Land, I don't think it was Philip at the time, but the high person there, begging them to let his wife go. Hubby 3 claimed that Murga was pregnant. And this is why these people disgust me. That didn't stop the torturers from doing what they do. She would be forced under severe physical duress. The record here just specifies that she was forced into confession. The rumor was that she was tortured severely to get this confession. And it was the first confession was that she offed hubby number 2, and by extension took out all of the kids that she had with him as a sacrifice. Yeah, there's that. They would then force her to confess to taking out current hubby's employer's family member, which there was some weird rumor going around that she had possibly a tryst or something along those lines with one of these people, or they hit on her and she rebuffed them. It wasn't clear. There was some black and or some very gray area, not black and white. So who knows what really went on? But they claimed later, after she was arrested, that she cursed this person to death. Okay, not quite how that works. And with their skills and talents, the torturers, so sorry to use the proper term back in the day, the investigators, would make her confess to participating in a Sabbath of Satan, including sacrifices. These people were off their rockers. With this information that Murga was pregnant, they then turned their disturbed little brains to get her to confess to copulating with a devil to gain the child that she carried, saying that she was birthing a monster. It was rumored, local rumors, that hubby number 3 and Murga were having difficulties conceiving because they'd been married for 14 years and no children. So of course, copulating with the devil was the most logical answer. These people. It couldn't be because she was getting too old to bear children. Some of the references put her at about 45-ish. Still possible, not likely. And that would have still put her getting married at like 36, 37. It's a little difficult even today. It's possible, don't get me wrong. But the older you get, the harder it is to conceive children. So, yeah, they didn't have kids. She was not a young bride at that point. And, of course, this didn't stop the madness of the witch hunters. They would torture her until she confessed, and then they would drag her to the stake and burn her innocent soul later on in the fall of 1603. For approximately 4 months, she was beaten, tortured, threatened. We won't go into much more detail because I don't want to get in trouble. But it was very ruthless what they did to her. And because she was actually pregnant, all the documents stated that, they got to notch 2 deaths into their bloody, evil little hearts. It's just disgusting. Thankfully, this reign of terror would come to an abrupt end after 4 years. Balthasar would pass away into the arms of the devil himself in 1606. B2 would be prosecuted by the new Prince Abbot who was installed, and B2 would be convicted of many crimes: torture, brutality, murder, but also he would be charged with using his position as a criminal magister to enrich himself with false accusations and unlawful land grabs. That explains some of what was going on there. This would lead to a sentence of 12 years, but don't think that that was a light sentence. It was 12 years before he lost his head in 1618 under the careful hand of the executioner. If you want to know how brutal that death is, it sounds nice and sounds quick. It wasn't. It usually took 3 to 4, if not more, depending on how much the executioner hated the person, swings to remove head from body. It's not like in the movies where it's one swift cut and it's over. No. No. B2 paid for a little bit for his crimes, and as his soul fell into hell, hopefully he's still paying for the rest of them. Anyhow, not a big fan of this character. So this is the type of place that would have held the quote-unquote witches during their torture, or before their executions. And if you look this direction, there's a little courtyard. You can see the gate right here. And it was in this courtyard, which would be right over here somewhere, where the burnings would occur, and it was a very public place to happen. So this wasn't just done behind high castle walls where no one could see. These were public. Disturbing public. But it was a way to reinforce the fact that we are the ones in control, and you will do what we say. Nope. But I will give the city of Fulda credit. In 2008, they would erect this monument as a memorial to the accused witches of the 1600s. And I could not get a clear definition or picture of the plaque, but this stands in a park in Fulda, which would be kind of cool to go see, honestly, just to kind of see what's written there. It's probably in German, but that doesn't mean you can't translate it. So they did try to make amends for their less than stellar history, and that's about all I can find about this particular person and the Fulda witch trials. There's a little bit out there, but not as much as you might think. The witch trials were over time swept really hard. They were also buried. There were a lot of records destroyed under accidental fires, trying to hide the atrocities that were done. There's still a lot out there about situations, not so much specific people. My plan with this is to go over the ones that I can find access and information to, and without actually like going out and trying to learn German, there's not a lot about Balthasar that is available in history books that I could get a hold of. Doesn't mean that there's not more out there, it's just what I could find. And if you like this vein of discussion, and like I said, I have to be kind of careful with what I say considering the channels we're on here, but this is something that I've looked into for years, obviously. And the darkness that surrounds what a lot of modern witches would call the burning times, it is kind of amazing to me that people would do this. The absolute blind fanaticism that would lead people to scream witch and torture people into confessions bothers me a lot. And when we talk about torture, you see the pictures, and you know, they joke about it in like some of the modern day movies, The Pit and the Pendulum and things like that. This was not a joke back in the day. These were things that were actually done to people, and it was done in the name of a religious order that was trying to squash all opposition. Most of the people, and I do mean most of the people that were attacked during this dark period of human history and religious history and all the rest of it, were simply the wise women and men. They were the healers. They were the practitioners of the ancient religions. They were those on spiritual journeys, not so much accepted by the church at that time. It could just be some of the oddball people. There was references when you go through this to, those two men lived together, they were witches, or those two women lived together, they were witches. Are you kidding? Enough. Thankfully, we've gotten out of this. But during this time period, the motto of the church, the Inquisition, the witch hunters, was comply or die. There was not another option. You either did what they said, whether it was under torture or not, or they would just outright execute you. And even if you did comply, in a lot of cases, that didn't mean anything. They were so bloodthirsty that even if you did comply, you were still burned at the stake. You were still pressed. You were still hung by the neck. This time period triggered some of the worst parts of people. And it's something that I don't want people to forget. I bring it up here, talking about it. We talked about like the positive aspects of Gerald Gardner, of Alex Sanders, of Maxine Sanders, of Doreen Valiente, and all of the rest of them, to show that there's a lot of positivity that has come from this, the darkness of this time period. And like I said, I want to go over the ones that are some of the ones that are well known, bring up some of the ones that are maybe lesser known, just to give us an idea of the counterbalance, especially of why even today the term witch or Wicca or witchcraft is, even in a more modern time where it's not as dark, is still viewed with negativity. It's negativity that has been rooted into our psyche for so many years. Up until around the late 1300s, early 1400s, the dates are a little vague there, being a witch just meant that you were someone outside the church. It didn't mean anything. It literally meant you could have been an atheist. You'd have been still called a witch because you weren't within the reign of the church at that time. Good, bad, indifferent, doesn't matter. They decided, the church did, in the mid 1300s to the mid 1400s, there were some shifts that were occurring within the authority of the church councils, and they started to shift things, little things, but they also started to restrict access to the documentation. Being literate started to become not important to people, so you did what you were told because they said this is what was in the books. Probably wasn't what was in the books, but that's what they said. You also had the first publication of some of the more notorious texts of witch hunting, which is like the Malleus Maleficarum and a few others that came later, all occurred during this mid 1300s to mid 1400s time period. There was a huge shift that occurred, and my personal opinion on this, if we bring this stuff to light, it will remind us that just because someone practices spirituality in a different way doesn't mean they're bad. Just because this person may not agree with everything that, and I don't care what church you go to, that group stands for, it doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't matter if you're a Jehovah's Witness, a Baptist, a Lutheran, a Catholic, a Mormon. You don't have to agree 100% with your authority of the church. You can understand the base doctrine and agree with that. That's great. But these people in this time period, if you didn't agree with every single word, whether it changed or not, with the authority of that church, you could be branded as being a witch, and then they would hunt. So there's some darkness around this time, and that's the reason I was kind of saving this for the fall. We're moving into the Halloween season. So like I said, if there's something that you're interested in and you want me to keep going with this, we've only done 2 so far. I plan on doing a couple more anyway, because I've got some picked out, and we'll see where this goes. Otherwise, you can let me know in the comments down below. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this stream. I thank you guys for popping in and out here. If you enjoyed this, please drop a like on the video. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. And like I said, we'll be next week, because this is the first and the third weeks. Mondays I do Occult and Crochet. The second and fourth we do Myth and Tarot. We'll be going over critter from mythology. We've been kind of sticking with Hercules, so we'll probably stay with that vein of thought for a few more weeks. And with that, I will let you guys go. Have a great rest of your evening, and I will see you in the next video. Where's my button?